All right, welcome to Gamemaker tutorial number 2. So in this tutorial, we're going to go through another game that involves some dragons, and some of the topics we're going to talk about throughout this tutorial is life cycle, how we have objects in our game and how each object has its own life cycle. Talk about objects versus instances of those objects, or in other languages we would call that classes versus instances. Talk about variables and global variables versus local variables. In Gamemaker, something called relative, we'll talk about that. Talk about player movements, so more with events, moving fixed, moving vertical, or reverse vertical. Events, we'll get in there, especially when an object gets outside of a room, when we intersect a boundary, when we have collision, which we kind of already did, and then actions here. So we're going to, those are the types of concepts we're going to get into with this tutorial. If you go to Canvas, all I want you to do is to download a Dragon Rescue shell. It's a shell because it's going to be a starter file for you. So you're going to download that file. And what you should be able to do, you might be able to then click on that file. It's going to be a .gmz file, which is a Gamemaker compressed file. If you are unable to just double click it, you can go into Gamemaker and you can import that project. So if you go to import and find where you downloaded that shell, it should be called, let's see, where is it? Dragon Rescue shell. You can click on that and import it. And that should basically create a project in Gamemaker, and it should load in a bunch of stuff already for you. So if we go through this, you can see that there's a bunch of sprites available to you. That's going to be part of our game. So we're not going to focus so much on sprite development in this tutorial. A lot of them are just created for you. There's some sounds and there's some backgrounds. So if you look in some of these sprites, if you look in the sprite, like the baby, for example, this is going to be part of our little storyline that we have to rescue these little baby dragons. And they're already here for you. So if you click on edit, you're also going to notice that there's 2 images there, or 2 frames. This is very similar to multiple costumes in Scratch. As we'll see when we get into animation, Gamemaker makes it a lot easier than Scratch to just automatically do this. If you show a preview, you can see what this sprite is going to look like, because it's automatically going to cycle through those images. And you can switch up the speeds and all that kind of stuff as well. So we have a dragon baby that we're going to rescue. We're also going to have this boss right here. And you can see that there are 4 images there, 4 costumes that it cycles through. There's going to be these little monsters that are going to be in the game, and those are going to be the enemies that we try to eliminate. And then the main character here is right here. This is your little dragon sprite. And you can see, again, a bunch of images in there that it cycles through. There's a little fireball that we're going to use, which is just 1 image. But you can see the sprites in there, and then also there's some sounds in there, and there's some backgrounds. And that is it for your starter files here. So what kind of game are we going to create? So again, here's a template, and this time after the tutorial, you're going to start to use this template to design your own game and to think about a little bit of a backstory to your game as well. Okay, so this is just one that was made up. The gameplay is just going to be, you're going to be a player that you're going to dodge monsters and shoot fireballs in order to save baby dragons from an evil monster. The game will increase in difficulty as it progresses. So there's the gameplay. Now, as we're going to talk about in class and things to consider, when we write out kind of a backstory and the main characters and the conflict involved, it can really add meaning and direction in your project and how you design things. So I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but little bit of a storyline, kind of a silly storyline that we kind of made up here. But the basic conflict, there's an evil monster that has stolen a mother dragon's babies. The mother has followed the evil monster to his lair and is battling him to retrieve her precious babies. The goal of the game is to save all the babies. The major events, the monster is going to shoots mini monsters, which actually must be dodged, or you're actually going to try to shoot fireballs at them. And then there's going to be babies that you're going to try to collect that you don't want to harm. You want to try to collect those. And so those are the main events. We have a different setting here. And if you go into the protagonist, the good guy versus the bad guy, there is a whole long kind of storyline about these two characters. Okay, made up, but this is part of the game development that can really, again, be really useful instead of just having some sort of game and just not really having a backstory to it. If you kind of can draw the user who's playing the game in with some sort of a story, it really brings meaning to a lot of those elements. And it also helps you as a designer stick to sort of the themes of your characters and the themes of your games. So there's a good guy, there's a bad guy. You can see that we went in quite a bit of depth on describing the good and the bad guy. In this case, the protagonist, the good guy, is Protagona. Very original name there. That's the mother dragon. That's you. That's the dragon. And the antagonist is Antagon, I can't even say it. Right. That's the monster that you are. That's the boss that you are fighting. And so this is a little bit of a template to think about the storyline, to think about planning your game out. Right. So we have a mother dragon. We're going to be trying to collect her babies, as well as get rid of the little monsters that are going to come our way. And we're going to have scores like before. We're going to have different variables and different events that we're going to get into. All right, so back to our game maker. Let's start to create some of these things. I can see here that there are no rooms created, just some sprites, sounds, and backgrounds. So we're going to create a room. So go ahead and create a room. And if we go to settings, we're going to name this room. This is going to be our kind of our main setting. This is going to be the cave. So we're going to name this RM underscore, I'm going to call it RM cave, room cave. And I'm just going to leave the default settings in there for now. When we go to backgrounds, if you go to backgrounds, we're going to select a background that was already loaded for us, and that's going to be the background cave right here. See, that should load right in there. And we're going to add some objects into our room as well. We haven't created any objects yet, however, so we're going to come back to that. So we have this room. There's no objects in here yet. I'm going to say OK, and let's go ahead and start to create some of these objects. All right, so we got a room. Let's go to objects, and we're going to create an object. So let's create the main character. So we're going to say obj, and let's just call this dragon. So object dragon. And let's select the sprite that it's going to use, which is already created for us, and that's going to be the sprite dragon, which is right there. We got this as visible, and then we're going to start to create our events. All right, so we want to be able to move our object with the keyboard this time. So we're not. In our last project, we just used the mouse, and we didn't do any sort of keyboard movements. But let's start adding some events. So let's add a keyboard event. So now we go to events, and we go to keyboard, and let's just add one for up. So if we press the up, and if we press up, we're going to use this little button here, which is move fixed, I believe. So we click in here, it says move fixed. It's going to apply to self, and we're going to say which direction we want to move in or start moving in, and that's going to be up. And the speed we're going to put as 16 for now, right? And you can sort of mess around with that as you develop your game, but let's leave it at 16. So I have up, and let's make a down as well. So let's add an event for keyboard, and let's make that down. And then we're going to move fixed again. So we're going to click and drag this time go down and make that 16. And we're going to say OK. And let's just start there, right? So we're going to incrementally code and then test our code. So now we have an object. Let's go back to our cave, right? So double click back in our cave, and let's we're going to add our dragon into this room. So our objects, we have this object dragon here. I'm going to click once on that. So I add this. I'm going to put this dragon, or our main character, kind of on the left side, like right here. Should be good. And that's all we're going to have here. We're just going to say OK from that. And from there, let's go ahead and run it and see what we have just with the events that we put in there. So we can test it out, and as it compiles, okay, you can see my sprites there. My sprite's moving automatically. If I click on up, it goes up and down, and it actually just it just continues to go in that direction. Once I press down, it just keeps going down, and once I press up, it keeps going up. So that's a little bit of a problem, because if I let go of those arrows, I don't really want the dragon to move, right? And it actually kind of goes way off the screen. And so if I press down again, it's not in my room, but it does calculate those coordinates to be like way off the screen. So let's fix that. So go back to our dragon object, and so to fix that, we're going to create something called no key, another keyboard event. So if we go to add event, go back to the keyboard, this time select no key. So this is like a special event that basically is if no key is being pressed. If there's no key that's being pressed at the current time, then what should we do? Well, in this case, I'm going to move fixed the same way, and I'm just going to select this middle option, which is to not move, right? And the speed, I don't think we need to put anything there. We're just going to say OK on that. So therefore, if the up arrow is pressed, it's going to go up. If I let go of up, it'll say, oh, there's no key being pressed, and it will stop moving. And so it'll kind of cycle through these three events. And what else do we need here? We're going to need fireballs in a little bit, but let's say OK and just test that one more time so you can see what the new key or the no key event does. So we have up, down. You can see when I stop here, you know, we have some basic movement up, down, and that's it, right? All right, so let's go ahead and create a fireball. So this is going to be what the dragon kind of shoots. So let's create another object. Create an object. In this case, we're going to say obj, and let's call this fireball, and select the sprite fire, which is right here. And if we go into that, this is really not going to have too much inside of it. When the fireball is created, there's really only one thing that it's going to do. The fireball is simply going to move forward or move to the right. So I'm going to add an event, and you can think of objects when you create an object. right? You can think of that as an instance of the object, because right now we're defining, and in all of these objects right here on the left-hand side, we're defining what a fireball object does, what it is, what it looks like. But when we actually put it in our game and we create multiple fireballs, those are called instances of that object, or instances of a class. So we can create multiple objects from our definition, from our definition of what we're putting inside these properties. So I want you to go ahead and do a create object. So when this object is created, when this instance is created, we're going to move fixed, and we're going to go to the right, and we're going to set a speed. You can test this out, but I'm going to put 32 here. So when a fireball is created, its only job is to move to the right. So there is a kind of a point in time where objects are created, and then there's a point in time that the object is sort of living and doing something, and then there's a point in time when the object is no longer needed and it should be destroyed. And so one key thing to do here is we're going to add another event. In this case, we're going to talk about the outside room. If you go to Other, so go to Events and go to Other and go to Outside of the Room, right? So basically, this is an event that if a fireball is outside of the room, right, what should we do? If that fireball is off the screen, then we're just going to destroy the object. We're going to get rid of it. Remember, in programming, if we are creating a bunch of objects, right, we're using up memory in our computer. We're using up a bunch of RAM in our computer, and we don't want to necessarily bloat up the memory that we're using if we're not using objects in our program. So we want to kind of get rid of these things if they're not being used. So we're going to destroy the instance. So once the fireball is outside the room, I want you to go to main 1, and then we talked about this in the previous tutorial, destroy instance. We're going to say self. So we're going to say OK. All right, and that's really all the fireball does. The other thing that we do want to do, because this is going to be involved in some collision detection, we're going to set this object to solid. We're going to go ahead and select it to solid. Now we're going to say OK. So there's a fireball. Right? So now we have two objects. Now I want to go back to the dragon. So go back to our main character, dragon. If you go back to the dragon, we're going to create another event for spacebar. So let's go add event. I want you to click on keyboard, and let's go ahead and do press space. Actually, we don't necessarily want this one. Okay, so there's a couple different keyboard events that you can see here. There's just keyboard, there's keyboard press, and there's keyboard release. So it gives us a lot of options here. In this case, what I want to do is do a keyboard press right here, not just a normal keyboard, a keyboard press. So if we press down on the space bar, right, that's going to be our event. When we press spacebar, we want to shoot a fireball. Okay, so essentially we want to create a fireball. We want to instantiate one of these fireball objects, and it's going to be sort of born into our world. It's going to, show up on our screen, and then it's going to live, and then eventually it's going to die. So when the spacebar is pressed, we're going to create a fireball. So how do we do that? We're going to go to main 1, and this first little button here where it says create instance, right? We're going to create an instance, and we can select which object we want to create an instance of. So we're going to create a fireball right here. And the thing that we have to, well, you know what? Let's just go ahead and say OK on this. You can see that there's an X and a Y, and it's 0, 0. And I want to talk about that 0, 0 while we test our program. So let's say OK on that. Let's say OK on this, and then let's run this program, and you'll see what happens. So when I am here and I press spacebar, you can see the fireball is going into existence and it's moving to the right, and then it's destroyed once it gets outside of the room. Now, it's created and put into the world at coordinates 0, 0. So when you think of this box, you think of your room, you can think of coordinates, in math class. Typically, in math class, if you have an X and Y grid, 0, 0 is usually like in the middle, right, of the, of the box. In this case, 0, 0 is on the top left. It's a little bit different with a lot of programming languages and screens and stuff like that. So the origin 0, 0 is on the top left. Now X is still our horizontal axis. Y is still our vertical axis. And if I make X positive, then I'm going to be going off to the right from this upper left corner. Now, if I add something to Y, if Y increases, I'm going to be going down. Okay, so this is actually not negative in this case. If I said Y is 100, I'd be going from the top left and I'd be going down like 100 pixels. If I say X is 100, I'd be going to the right 100 pixels. Okay, so really, in terms of these coordinates, there's really no negative coordinates on this grid because you have a positive X and then you have a positive Y. If you subtract from the Y's, it's going to start going up. If you add to the Y, it's going to start going down, which is kind of a little bit counterintuitive if you think about your math class. Same thing for X's. If you're going to add X or add to the X value, the position, it's going to go to the right, which makes sense. And then if you subtract from X, it's going to go to the left. Now the problem that we have here is that when we create the fireball, we're saying go ahead and create the fireball in the position of 0, 0, an absolute position. We're saying go to the actual coordinate 0, 0 and create the fireball there. What we want to do is create the fireball wherever the dragon is currently located when we press space, whatever the dragon's coordinates are. And we don't necessarily know what those coordinates are going to be when space is pressed. So how do we do that? So if I go back to the dragon, and you go back to space, and you go back to this fireball, this is where relative is going to come in handy. Okay, you can see when I hover over it says values are relative to the current values. Right? So I'm going to say click on relative. And so what that's going to do is it's going to say create this fireball object relative to what the dragon's X and Y coordinates are. Right? So I'm going to say OK on that. And let's just see what that does. So I'm going to play that. And this should help us out a little bit. Now if we run it, you can see that it's kind of shooting out maybe like it's almost like the back side of the dragon. Because the origin or the origin or center of the dragon is, if we look at the sprite, it's probably at that top left corner right here. So we could fix that a couple different ways. Let's say that we want it to look like the fireball is really just like shooting out of the dragon's like mouth instead of like the back of its head. So we can alter that a little bit. If we go back to where we were, we can make sure that the fireballs are relative, but we can also add some to the X and some to the Y. So let's say we add 100 to the X. And let's say we're going to move it down slightly. So I'm going to add 10 to the Y. Now let's do that. Say OK and run that one more time. Now you can see these fireballs are going to be created, and you can see it's relative to the XY of the dragon, but it's also offset. It adds 100 to the X and it added 10 to the Y, so now it looks like it's really just coming out of the mouth right here. And if I move the dragon and I press space, it's going to change where it's created based on where the dragon's XY is. Alright, so now we have something working. We're creating objects, we're creating instances of objects, and then those objects are being destroyed once it gets outside of the room. Alright, so we have our main character here. Let's go ahead and start to create our boss here. So let's go and create another object, and this time say obj, and we're going to say boss, and use the sprite that is the boss. And okay, so this is going to be obviously the enemy. And here we want the boss. We can do this a lot of different ways. But all we're going to do is when the boss is created, so when this level starts, so let's create an add event, and let's do a create event for the boss. When the boss is created, or when that level starts, we're going to move the boss, move fixed, and we're going to create the boss with a speed of 8, and we're going to set it off either up or down. The boss is really just going to go in like one dimension. It's going to go up or down, and basically we want that boss to also, when it gets to the bottom or the top of the screen, we want it to sort of bounce off that screen. We don't want it to go off of the screen. So we're going to start with this. We're going to say start moving up or down. But then also, we're going to add another event, and there's a special one here called intersect boundary. Intersect boundary is a really handy event, so that when this object, when the boss gets to the edge of the room, doesn't leave the room completely, just intersects that very top or the bottom of the room, what do we want it to do? So a nice little command that we have here is going to be to just reverse the direction of its movement. Okay, and so far there's been nice little handy buttons here that we can use, and there's another one here under the move, and I wish it like wrote what it was, but it's this one right here. If you right click it, it's called reverse the vertical direction, and that's all we're going to put in there. We're just going to say if the boss gets to the top or the bottom boundary, it's just going to reverse its direction. So if it was going up, it's going to go down. If it's going down, it's going to go up. And that's all so far. Right? So let's say okay on that. And let's add that to the room. And that'll kind of wrap up just part 1 of this tutorial. I like to keep these videos to like 30 minutes because I don't want to create one that's like 2 hours long. But anyways, let's go to the room cave, and right here we have our main character, and then let's add an object for the boss, and we're just gonna put the boss like over here, like at the very the right edge of our room. So now we're gonna have a left and a right, kind of a simple stage setup here. We're going to say okay on that, and let's just see how this thing runs. Hopefully our boss will, whoa, something's not going, it is not working as intended there, and what I think is happening there is that he is intersecting the backside of the room, and so it's constantly intersecting the boundary there. So I'm a little bit too close to the back. Let's fix that, and let's make this come off the edge a little bit. I don't want it to be too far up. And maybe what I would do if I want more space is just make my room bigger, or make my characters smaller. But let's just move it up a little bit. Now let's try that one more time. Alright, so now we have this kind of setup here. Right? I can move up and down. I can shoot right now, and nothing's happening because I haven't programmed anything else besides this. But we have the boss who's moving up and down, and the boss isn't doing anything right now. But that is going to be our next stage here, is to have the boss start firing some other objects. So that takes care of part 1.